The second call arrived at 12:40, 3 in the morning. Dispatcher Melissa Grant almost ignored it. The number looked familiar, but during overnight shifts she handled dozens of calls every hour. Noise complaints, minor accidents, intoxicated arguments. The phone line blinked red again, signaling an incoming emergency. She answered. County Emergency Services. What is your emergency? What? For a moment, there was only breathing. Heavy, uneven. Then a man's voice whispered something that made her sit upright in her chair. He's still here. Melissa frowned. Sir, can you tell me your address? More breathing. The voice came again, lower this time. I think he knows I called you. Melissa's fingers began typing automatically as she opened a new incident file. Sir, I need your address so we can send officers. The caller hesitated. Then he said something strange. You were already here. Melissa stopped typing. Sir, what do you mean? The man's breathing became faster. I heard the police earlier, outside. I thought he left after that. Melissa checked the incoming number on her screen. Her stomach tightened. She recognized it now. The phone number belonged to a man who had called roughly 40 minutes earlier reporting a suspected intruder in his home. Units had been dispatched, but the responding officers had already cleared the scene. They reported finding the house secure. No sign of forced entry, no sign of disturbance. The homeowner had not answered the door. Melissa spoke carefully. Sir, officers were at your address earlier tonight. They reported no contact with the homeowner. Silence filled the line. Then the caller spoke again. His voice sounded confused. I didn't answer the door because he was upstairs. Melissa felt a cold sensation move through her chest. Sir, what is your name? Thomas. A faint sound echoed through the phone line. A floorboard creaking. Melissa leaned closer to her headset. Thomas, are you somewhere safe right now? The whisper came back. No. Another creak. Footsteps. Slow, measured. Melissa began dispatching units again. Her voice remained calm. Thomas, officers are on the way. Stay on the line with me. The breathing grew louder. He's coming down the stairs. Melissa could hear it now too. Footsteps. Then a thump. Something heavy hitting the floor. The line went silent. The call disconnected. Melissa stared at the screen. Dispatch protocol required her to document every emergency call, but something about this one unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain. Because she remembered the earlier report, and she remembered how the responding officers had described what they found. They said the house was dark. The doors were locked. The homeowner never answered, but one officer had looked through the living room window with his flashlight. He thought he saw something lying on the floor. At the time, they assumed it was furniture. Now Melissa wasn't so sure. She immediately radioed the patrol units already responding. This is dispatch. Possible escalation at the Avery residence. A voice answered through static. Dispatch, confirm. We're about 2 minutes out. Melissa swallowed. Caller states suspect is inside the home. Sounds like movement upstairs. The responding officer paused. Then, he said something that caused the room around Melissa to feel suddenly colder. Dispatch, we cleared that house earlier tonight. Wes. Will looked through the window. Melissa already knew what he was going to say next. There was someone on the floor. The officer's voice dropped. We thought he was asleep. The patrol car reached the house at 12:40, 7 in the morning. The Avery residence sat on the corner of a quiet suburban street where nothing ever happened. Single-story homes. Neatly trimmed lawns. Streetlights casting pale yellow circles onto empty pavement. Officer Daniel Ruiz parked near the curb while his partner stepped out of the vehicle. The house looked exactly the way they had left it earlier. Dark, still, silent. Ruiz approached the front door. He knocked. Police department. No response. He knocked again. Nothing. His partner walked around the side of the house, scanning the windows with a flashlight. Back doors locked. Ruiz tested the front handle locked. He stepped to the living room window and shined his light through the glass. The beam illuminated the carpet. Then it moved slowly across the room and stopped. The shape was still there, exactly where they had seen it earlier. Ruiz leaned closer. The flashlight beam revealed a man lying face down on the floor, Not asleep. Not moving. Ruiz's voice became sharp. Call it in. His partner was already reaching for the radio. Possible homicide. Ruiz forced the door open moments later. The living room smelled faintly metallic. Blood. Thomas Avery lay motionless on the carpet. A single gunshot wound to the back of his head. The blood had already dried, which meant something impossible. The man had been dead for a long time. Ruiz looked at the clock on the wall. 12:49. Then he remembered something that made his stomach tighten. The second emergency call had come in just minutes earlier. Ruiz turned toward his partner. Dispatch just spoke with the homeowner. His partner nodded slowly. I know. They both looked at the body again. Because the medical examiner would later determine something that made the timeline collapse entirely. Thomas Avery had been dead since roughly 11:45 that night. Nearly an hour before the second call was placed, which meant the voice on the phone could not have been him. The case file reached Detective Rachel Monroe the following afternoon. She read the timeline 3 times before setting the report down. Then she looked up at the homicide board in her office. Rachel Monroe had investigated dozens of violent crimes over the past decade. She had seen staged suicides, false confessions, elaborate alibis. But she had never seen a timeline like this. A victim who called police before he died, and then apparently called them again after. Rachel leaned back in her chair. There were only 2 possibilities. Either the time of death was wrong, or someone else had used the victim's phone. She picked up the incident report again. The medical examiner's estimate was based on body temperature, lividity, and blood coagulation. Those methods weren't perfect, but they rarely missed by an entire hour. Rachel closed the file. There was another detail in the report that bothered her even more. When officers arrived earlier that night after the first emergency call, they never entered the home. They knocked. They looked through the window. They saw a shape on the floor, but they assumed it was nothing. Rachel stood and grabbed her jacket. If the victim was already lying dead inside the house when officers arrived the first time, then someone else had been inside with him. And that person had waited long enough to make a second phone call pretending to be a dead man. Rachel Monroe drove toward the Avery residence just after 3 in the afternoon. Crime scene tape still surrounded the property. Uniformed officers stood near the front yard speaking quietly. The neighborhood looked disturbed. Residents peered from windows. Someone down the street was speaking with reporters. Rachel stepped under the tape and approached the front door. Inside, forensic technicians were still processing the scene. She crouched beside the body location marker on the carpet. The stain from the blood had been partially cleaned but remained visible. A dark circle on the floor. Rachel looked around the room. No signs of struggle. Furniture untouched. Nothing overturned. Which suggested something very important. Thomas Avery had not been attacked unexpectedly. He had been facing away from the shooter. Possibly walking away. Possibly trusting the person behind him. Rachel stood slowly. Where's the phone? A technician pointed toward the kitchen counter. The victim's cell phone rested inside an evidence bag. Rachel examined the call log. First emergency call, 11:56. Second call, 12:43. She looked toward the living room again. Medical examiner estimated time of death approximately 11:45, which meant the first call happened after the victim was already dead. Rachel's expression hardened. The case was stranger than dispatch initially realized. Because neither call should have been possible. Someone had used the victim's phone twice, and had done it while standing inside a house containing a dead body. Rachel turned to the technician. Any forced entry? The technician shook his head. Doors locked. Windows locked. No damage. Rachel frowned. Security system. Disabled. Be who? The technician shrugged. System log says manual shutdown. Rachel looked toward the hallway leading deeper into the house. The killer hadn't broken in. The killer had been allowed inside, which meant the victim knew them. Rachel walked slowly toward the staircase leading down to the basement. Something about the house felt wrong. Too quiet. Too staged. She reached the basement door and opened it. Cold air drifted upward. Rachel descended the stairs slowly. The basement lights flickered on when she flipped the switch. At first glance, the space looked ordinary. Storage boxes, old furniture, a workbench. But then she noticed something strange near the far wall. A folding chair, positioned directly in the center of the room, facing a small table, and on that table sat a digital recorder. Rachel stepped closer. The recorder's battery indicator still blinked red. It had been recording recently. She pressed play. Static crackled through the speaker. Then a voice began speaking. Thomas Avery's voice. Calm, measured, as if he had expected someone to listen to this. The recording began with a sentence that made Rachel Monroe feel a slow chill move down her spine. If you're hearing this, then it means he finally did it. Before we continue the investigation, a quick note for viewers following these cases closely. If you're new here and you enjoy deep investigative stories that reconstruct real events piece by piece, consider subscribing to the channel. Each episode examines how detectives uncover the truth hidden inside confusing timelines and misleading evidence. And in this case, the timeline may be the most disturbing part of the entire story, because by the time detectives discovered the recording you're about to hear, the man speaking on it had already been dead for hours. Detective Rachel Monroe stood alone in the Avery basement, holding the small digital recorder. The device was older, one of the compact models often used for voice notes or interviews. A thin red light blinked slowly on its side, indicating the battery was still active. The technician upstairs had told her the recorder was discovered already powered on, which meant someone had deliberately left it running. Rachel pressed play again. Static filled the basement. Then Thomas Avery's voice returned. Calm, deliberate. If you're hearing this, then it means he finally did it. Rachel didn't interrupt the recording. Avery continued. I'm not sure exactly when someone will find this. Maybe tonight. Maybe tomorrow. But if you're listening to this, there's a good chance I'm already dead. Rachel slowly lowered herself into the folding chair facing the table. The position of the chair suddenly made sense. Avery hadn't left the recorder accidentally. He had sat here, in this exact spot, and spoken directly into the device. The voice on the recording continued. I've already called the police once tonight. I told them someone might be inside the house. Rachel frowned slightly. The timeline in the report said the emergency call came in at 11:56. But the medical examiner believed Avery had already been dead by then. The recording continued. I know they probably won't find anything. That's the problem. He's careful. He always has been. Rachel leaned forward. Avery's breathing on the recording sounded steady, controlled, not frightened. If something happens to me tonight, there are a few things investigators need to understand. The voice paused briefly. Rachel could hear what sounded like a chair creaking as Avery shifted his weight. I didn't pick this house randomly. I moved here because I thought it would be safe. Another pause. But people like him don't forget. Rachel felt a quiet tension forming in her chest. The statement suggested history, a conflict, a motive that stretched back long before the murder itself. Avery continued. I don't know if he's already inside the house or if he's still watching from outside. Rachel immediately wrote down the phrase, still watching, which meant the victim believed he was being monitored. The recording continued. If you're the detective listening to this, there's something in the basement you need to see. Rachel slowly turned her head and looked around the room again. The basement looked ordinary. Boxes, shelves, old furniture. Nothing obviously unusual. But Avery's voice returned with a quiet certainty. It's behind the workbench. Rachel stood immediately. The workbench sat against the far wall of the basement, a cluttered surface covered in tools and storage bins. She walked toward it slowly. On the recording, Avery continued speaking. I hid it where he wouldn't think to look. Rachel crouched beside the bench. Her eyes scanned the wall behind it. The concrete surface looked normal. But then she noticed something subtle. A faint rectangular outline in the paint. A section of the wall slightly cleaner than the surrounding area. Rachel pushed the workbench aside. It scraped across the floor with a rough sound. Behind it was a small metal panel, bolted into the concrete. Rachel stared at it for a moment. The panel had clearly been installed intentionally. This wasn't part of the original construction. She returned to the table and rewound the recording slightly. Avery's voice repeated the instruction. "It's behind the workbench." Rachel stepped back to the panel. 4 screws secured it to the wall. She used a screwdriver from the workbench and began loosening them. Each screw turned slowly. The metal panel finally came free. Behind it was a shallow cavity carved into the concrete. Inside the compartment sat a thin black folder. Rachel carefully removed it. Inside were several documents, printed photographs, and a small flash drive. Rachel opened the folder. The photographs were surveillance images. Most of them appeared to be taken from a distance. Parking lots, sidewalks, office buildings. Every photo contained the same man. Rachel examined the face closely, mid-30s. Short, dark hair, sharp jawline, expressionless in nearly every frame. Whoever this man was, Thomas Avery had been watching him for a long time. Rachel flipped to the next photograph. This one showed the man standing outside a courthouse. The timestamp printed in the corner was from 4 years earlier. The next image showed the same man entering a parking garage. Another timestamp, 3 years earlier. The photographs continued. Different locations, different months, always the same man. Rachel returned to the recorder and pressed play again. Avery's voice resumed. "The man in those photos is named Michael Halpern." Rachel repeated the name quietly. "Michael Halpern." Avery continued speaking. "He killed someone 6 years ago." Rachel felt the investigation shifting already. Technically, he was never convicted. Avery said on the recording, "But I know he did it." Rachel listened carefully. "I was the one who testified against him." The basement suddenly felt colder, because that explained everything. Motive, fear, the sense of being watched. Avery continued. "The trial fell apart because the evidence was weak." Halpern walked out of that courtroom smiling. Rachel imagined the moment. A man accused of murder leaving court without punishment. A witness left behind knowing the killer was still free. Avery's voice dropped slightly. But he didn't forget who testified. Rachel pressed pause. The pieces of the case were beginning to form a disturbing pattern. A revenge killing, 6 years delayed. But something still didn't make sense. Rachel rewound the recording again and listened to the first line. "If you're hearing this, then it means he finally did it." Avery had expected this. Expected it enough to prepare evidence. Expected it enough to record instructions for detectives. Rachel pressed play again. Avery continued. "If something happens tonight, there's one more thing investigators should know." The voice hesitated. Rachel leaned closer. "I installed cameras around the property 2 months ago." Rachel's eyebrows lifted. "I didn't connect them to the house network because I didn't want him detecting them." Rachel quickly scanned the basement again. If the cameras existed, the recordings might still be here. Avery continued speaking. "The footage saves directly to a drive hidden under the stairs." Rachel turned toward the wooden staircase behind her. The space underneath was partially enclosed by a small storage door. She opened it. Inside sat a compact security DVR. Its indicator light glowed green, still powered. Rachel removed the attached hard drive carefully. If the cameras had captured the killer arriving, the entire case might already be solved. Rachel stood quietly in the basement, holding the drive. But something still bothered her. Because of the phone calls. Even if Michael Halpern had killed Thomas Avery, someone still had to explain the impossible timeline. The victim had called emergency dispatch after he was already dead. And then someone had called again pretending to be him. Rachel returned to the recorder. Avery's voice delivered the final line of the message. "If the recording ends suddenly, it probably means he found me." A static followed. Then the recording stopped. Rachel stared at the device. The recorder's time display showed the total length of the message. 27 minutes, which meant Avery had been alive at least that long while recording it. Rachel slowly exhaled. The timeline just became even more complicated. Because, according to the medical examiner, Avery had died at approximately 11:45. But the recorder's timestamp indicated the recording ended just after midnight. Nearly 15 minutes later. Rachel Monroe looked toward the basement stairs. If the recorder was correct, then the medical examiner's estimate was wrong, which meant Thomas Avery might still have been alive when the first emergency call was made. And if that was true, then the second call might not have been made by a killer at all. Rachel switched off the recorder. The investigation had just taken its first real turn, because the victim hadn't simply been murdered. He had been waiting for the moment it would happen, and he had left behind enough evidence to prove exactly who would do it. What Rachel didn't know yet was that Michael Halpern had already spoken to police earlier that same night, hours before Thomas Avery's body was discovered. Detective Rachel Monroe left the Avery residence just before sunset. The evidence bag containing the basement hard drive sat on the passenger seat beside her. The small digital recorder rested inside another sealed bag on the console. The case had already begun to split into two competing timelines. The first was the official one. Thomas Avery died around 11:45 that night. The medical examiner's estimate was based on body temperature and early stages of lividity. According to that timeline, Avery was already dead before the first emergency call was placed. But the second timeline came directly from Avery himself, a recording that appeared to continue until shortly after midnight. A man calmly explaining that he believed someone was coming to kill him. A man who clearly expected investigators to hear the message after his death. Two timelines. Both couldn't be true. Rachel turned into the parking lot of the county police station and carried the evidence bags inside. The homicide unit was quieter than usual. Night shift detectives sat behind glowing computer screens while a television in the corner silently broadcast a 24-hour news channel. Rachel walked straight toward the digital forensics room. Technician Aaron Delgado was already waiting. "You're the one with the basement drive," he said. Rachel set the evidence bag on the counter. Security cameras around the victim's property. Aaron carefully opened the bag and removed the drive. "Let's see what Mr. Avery left us." The drive connected to the workstation with a soft click. Folders appeared on the screen almost instantly. Rachel leaned forward. "How many cameras?" Aaron opened the file directory. "Looks like 5. He began clicking through the video folders. "Front yard, backyard, driveway, side alley, and 1 camera mounted near the front door." Rachel pointed to the front yard footage. "Start there." Aaron pulled up the video timeline. Recording starts at 10 p.m. He dragged the cursor forward. The grainy black and white footage showed the quiet residential street outside the Avery home. Nothing unusual. Cars occasionally passed in the distance. Streetlights illuminated the pavement in pale circles. Rachel watched silently. Aaron increased the playback speed. 10:15, 10:30, 10:40. At 10:58 something changed. A vehicle appeared at the edge of the frame. Rachel leaned closer. The car moved slowly down the street. It was a dark sedan. The driver stopped briefly near the curb across from Avery's house. Aaron paused the video. Rachel examined the frame. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out. Even in the low-resolution footage, Rachel could recognize the figure. The man matched the photographs Avery had hidden behind the basement wall. Michael Halpern. Aaron zoomed in slightly. "Looks like our guy." Rachel nodded slowly. Halpern walked toward the sidewalk. He stood there for nearly a minute, not moving, not knocking, just watching the house. Aaron advanced the footage. At 11 o'clock exactly, Halpern crossed the street and approached the front door. Rachel watched carefully. Halpern knocked once, then again. The door opened. Rachel sat back slightly. Thomas Avery himself stood in the doorway. They appeared to exchange a few words. Then Avery stepped aside, allowing Halpern inside. Aaron paused the video again. "Well," he said quietly, "no forced entry." Rachel nodded. They knew each other. Aaron continued the playback. The door closed behind them. The camera showed nothing else for the next 40 minutes. Rachel studied the empty frame. Fast forward. Aaron moved the timeline ahead. 11:30. Still nothing. 11:40. The house remained dark and silent. Then, at 11:46, the front door opened again. Rachel leaned forward. Halpern stepped outside. He looked both directions down the street, then walked calmly back to his car. Aaron paused the video. Timestamp says 11:46. Rachel stared at the screen. The medical examiner estimated Avery died around 11:45, which meant Halpern leaving the house 1 minute later made perfect sense. Except for one problem. Rachel tapped the desk lightly. The first emergency call came in at 11:56. Aaron nodded. 10 minutes after this. Rachel looked back at the screen, which meant the man who made the first call, Sue, could not have been Halpern, because Halpern had already left the house. Aaron rewound the footage slightly. You want to see something else? Rachel nodded. Aaron zoomed into the driver's side of Halpern's vehicle. The door opened. Halpern sat inside. But before the car drove away, the camera captured one brief movement. Halpern looked back toward the house and smiled. Rachel watched the expression carefully. It wasn't relief. It wasn't panic. It looked almost satisfied. Aaron resumed playback. The sedan drove away slowly. The street returned to silence. Rachel crossed her arms. Check the driveway camera. Aaron opened another video file. The camera angle faced the side of the house and the narrow driveway leading toward the backyard. The footage began at 10 p.m. Rachel fast forwarded again. 11 o'clock. Halpern arrived at the door. 11:46. Halpern left. Nothing else. No other vehicles. No other people. Rachel frowned. So Halpern goes inside at 11, she said slowly. He leaves at 11:46. Aaron nodded. Which lines up with the estimated time of death. Rachel continued. But the first emergency call happens 10 minutes later. Aaron leaned back in his chair. Meaning someone else had to be inside the house. Rachel didn't respond immediately. Her eyes returned to the screen. The quiet suburban driveway. The empty yard. No sign of anyone entering. No sign of anyone leaving. Aaron looked at her. You thinking what I'm thinking? Rachel nodded slowly. Someone was already inside the house before Halpern arrived. Aaron raised an eyebrow. Avery never mentioned anyone else. Rachel turned back toward the evidence bag containing the recorder. That recording was deliberate, she said. He knew Halpern might come. Aaron folded his arms. You think Avery set something up? Rachel considered the idea. A victim preparing evidence before his own murder. Hidden photographs. Security cameras. A recorded message. Thomas Avery had clearly been preparing for something. But preparation didn't explain the second phone call. Rachel checked the timeline again. Halpern entered the house at 11. Left at 11:46. The first emergency call happened at 11:56. The second call happened at 12:43. Rachel exhaled slowly, which meant someone was inside the house for nearly an hour after Halpern left. Someone who never appeared on the cameras. Aaron opened another video folder. Backyard camera. A footage loaded. A small fenced yard behind the house. Dimly lit. Rachel watched carefully. At first nothing happened. The yard remained still. Then Aaron paused the video suddenly. Hold on. Rachel leaned closer. At 11:32, the camera briefly captured movement near the rear fence. A shadow passing across the frame. Rachel squinted. Zoom in. Aaron enlarged the image. The figure was partially obscured by darkness, but the shape looked human. Someone standing just outside the fence, watching the house. Rachel checked the timestamp. 11:32, which meant this person was outside while Halpern was still inside with Avery. Aaron advanced the footage. The figure moved slowly along the fence line, then disappeared from view. Rachel spoke quietly. Rewind. Aaron replayed the moment. The shadow returned briefly. This time Rachel noticed something else. The figure appeared to be holding something in one hand. A long object, possibly a crowbar or a tool. Aaron looked at her. You think that's our second guy? Rachel nodded slowly. Someone was waiting outside. Aaron leaned forward. But they never show up leaving. Rachel pointed at the timeline. Because they probably entered after Halpern left. Aaron glanced at the front yard footage again. The cameras should have caught that. Rachel stared at the screen. Unless the person already knew where the cameras were, or how to avoid them. Rachel leaned back in the chair. For the first time since the case began, the pieces were starting to connect. Michael Halpern may have come to confront Avery, maybe even to threaten him. But Halpern left the house alive. and someone else had been waiting outside the entire time. Waiting. Rachel stood up. "Run Halpern's location data," she said. Aaron nodded. "If he used his phone after leaving, we'll see it." Rachel walked toward the door and checked something else. Aaron looked up. "What?" Rachel paused in the doorway. "Look at the call log from Avery's phone again." Aaron frowned. "Why?" Rachel's voice lowered. "Because if Halpern left at 11:46, she pointed at the screen displaying the emergency call times. Then whoever made that first call at 11:56 was standing in the house with a dead body." Rachel stepped into the hallway. The investigation had just taken a darker turn, because the killer might not have been the man Thomas Avery was waiting for. And if the shadow outside the fence was real, then someone had been watching the entire confrontation unfold, waiting patiently for Halpern to leave, waiting for the house to become quiet again, waiting for the moment when Thomas Avery would finally be alone. Detective Rachel Monroe reviewed the dispatch records again the following morning. The timeline was printed across several pages of the incident report, each entry stamped with precise times pulled from the emergency call system. She read them slowly. 11:56 p.m. Incoming emergency call from Thomas Avery's phone. Caller reports someone may be inside the house. 12:04 a.m. Responding officers arrive. House appears secure. No contact with homeowner. 12:43 a.m. Second call from the same phone. Caller whispers that someone is still inside. Rachel tapped a pen lightly against the desk. The security footage from Avery's cameras clearly showed Michael Halpern leaving the house at 11:46, 10 minutes before the first call. Which meant one of two things had to be true. Either Avery was still alive after Halpern left and placed the call himself, or someone else had picked up his phone and dialed emergency services. Rachel leaned back in her chair. The problem with the first theory was the medical examiner's timeline. According to the initial report, Avery had likely died around 11:45. But the medical examiner had also admitted the estimate could be off by 20 or 30 minutes. Rachel picked up the phone on her desk. "Dr. Patel," she said when the line connected. The county medical examiner sounded tired. "You're calling about the Avery case?" "Yes." "What do you need?" Rachel opened the autopsy notes. "The time of death estimate." "How confident are you?" Dr. Patel hesitated. "It's an estimate. Those always are." "How much room for error?" "Possibly 30 minutes. Rachel stared at the call log on her desk. "If Avery died closer to midnight instead of 11:45. Dr. Patel finished the thought. "Then he could have made the first emergency call himself." Rachel nodded slowly. "But not the second one." "Correct." The second call came nearly 40 minutes later. Rachel thanked him and ended the call. Even if Avery had survived long enough to call the police the first time, someone else had clearly used the phone later. Rachel stood and walked toward the investigation board mounted on the wall. She placed the printed still frame of Michael Halpern leaving the house beneath the timeline. Then she added the image from the backyard camera, the shadow figure outside the fence. Two possible suspects. Two different positions. Halpern inside the house. Someone else outside. Rachel stepped back. Which meant the murder might not have been a simple revenge killing. It might have been something else entirely. Her phone rang. It was Aaron from Digital Forensics. "You'll want to see this," he said. Rachel grabbed her jacket and headed back toward the lab. Aaron had Avery's phone connected to a forensic workstation. Lines of data filled the screen. Call logs, GPS records, background processes. Rachel pointed at the timestamps. "Walk me through it." Aaron nodded. The first emergency call at 11:56 came directly from Avery's phone. Rachel waited. No sign of voice spoofing. No remote call, meaning the phone had been physically used inside the house. Aaron scrolled further down. The second call at 12:43 also came from the phone itself. Rachel frowned. No remote access. None. So someone inside the house dialed both calls. Aaron nodded. Rachel crossed her arms. "Can you tell if the phone moved?" Aaron pulled up the device location logs. Phone remained inside the residence from 11:30 until police arrived. Rachel looked back at the call log. If Halpern left at 11:46, Aaron finished the sentence. Then the person using the phone later wasn't him. Rachel paced slowly across the room. Unless Halpern came back. Aaron shook his head. We checked traffic cameras 2 blocks away. He pulled another video window onto the screen. The dark sedan from the earlier footage passed a nearby intersection at 11:48. Heading away from the neighborhood. Aaron pointed at the timestamp. Halpern never returned. Rachel studied the footage carefully. The car was clearly his, which meant the second caller was someone else entirely. Rachel returned her attention to Avery's phone. Anything else? Aaron nodded slowly. There's something strange. Rachel waited. Aaron opened a separate data file. Look at the microphone activation logs. Rachel frowned. What about them? Aaron enlarged the data line. The phone recorded audio activity starting at 11:55. Rachel read the timestamp, right before the first emergency call. Aaron nodded. Microphone stayed active until the call ended. Rachel leaned closer. Which is normal. Aaron shook his head. But then look at this. He highlighted another entry. Microphone activation. 12:42 a.m. Rachel looked confused. That's 1 minute before the second call. Aaron nodded again. The microphone activated automatically. Rachel stared at the log. Automatically. Aaron clicked another window. Phones sometimes trigger microphone activity if voice commands are detected. Rachel thought about that. So the phone might have been listening because someone spoke near it. Aaron nodded. Exactly. Rachel looked at the call log again. So someone inside the house spoke out loud near the phone. Aaron shrugged. Or something did. Rachel looked at him. What do you mean? Aaron hesitated. There's another possibility. Rachel waited. Aaron opened the audio recovery program. One managed to extract background audio from the phone's system buffer. Rachel stepped closer. What kind of audio? Aaron pressed play. The speakers produced a faint recording. Rachel heard the dispatcher's voice first. Then the whispering voice of the second caller. The same voice Melissa Grant described during the midnight call. He's still here. Rachel listened carefully. Something about the voice felt wrong. Too quiet. Too flat. Then the dispatcher asked for the address. The caller responded again. I think he knows I called you. Rachel suddenly noticed something strange. The cadence. The tone. It sounded exactly like the voice on the basement recorder. Rachel looked at Aaron. That's Avery. Aaron nodded slowly. That's what I thought too. Rachel shook her head. That's impossible. Avery had been dead for nearly an hour. Aaron replayed the audio. Rachel listened again. This time focusing on the subtle details. The pacing of the words. The unnatural pauses. The flat emotional tone. Rachel suddenly realized what she was hearing. She turned toward Aaron. That's not a live voice. Aaron raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Rachel pointed at the speakers. That's a recording. Aaron leaned closer. Rachel explained. Listen to the background noise. Aaron replayed the audio. Rachel tapped the desk. There's no ambient movement. No footsteps. No breathing changes. No shifting position. Just the same quiet tone repeating. Aaron's eyes widened. You think someone played the recorder near the phone? Rachel nodded. Exactly. Aaron stared at the data. So the second call wasn't someone pretending to be Avery. Rachel finished the thought. It was Avery's own voice. Aaron leaned back slowly. Someone inside the house had taken the digital recorder from the basement, played it near the phone, and used it to make the call. Rachel crossed her arms. Which means the caller didn't have to speak. Aaron nodded. They just had to press play. Rachel looked at the timeline again. Halpern left the house at 11:46. Avery may have died shortly after. Then someone else entered the house, someone who found the recorder, and used it to stage the second emergency call. Rachel turned toward the investigation board again. Michael Halpern was still the most likely killer. But the person who made the second call might have been someone else entirely, someone who knew exactly where the recorder was hidden. Rachel spoke quietly. Someone who knew Avery had prepared that recording. Aaron frowned, meaning they knew him. Rachel nodded slowly. And they knew this house. The case was beginning to expand in a direction no one had expected, because the second caller might not have been the killer at all. It might have been someone trying to send a message, or someone trying to make sure police discovered the body. Rachel picked up Avery's phone again. There was one final detail she hadn't looked at yet. The contacts list. She opened the recent call history. Most of the numbers were ordinary, work contacts, family, local businesses, but one number appeared repeatedly over the past week. Rachel stared at the name attached to it. The contact was saved simply as Rachel. She froze, because she had never spoken to Thomas Avery before, and she had never given him her phone number, which meant the man who believed he was about to be murdered had somehow expected Detective Rachel Monroe to be the one investigating his death. Detective Rachel Monroe stared at the contact entry on Thomas Avery's phone. Her own name appeared on the screen. Rachel, no last name, no department listing, just the name. Saved in the victim's contacts. She checked the number carefully. It was hers, her direct work line. Rachel felt a slow tightening in her chest. Thomas Avery had never filed a report with her. He had never appeared in any of her case files. There was no official reason he should have known her name. And yet he had saved her number. Recently. Rachel checked the timestamp beside the contact entry. The number had been added 3 days before Avery's death. Rachel looked toward Aaron. "You're sure the phone data hasn't been altered?" Aaron shook his head. "Forensic extraction. It's clean." Rachel turned the screen slightly so he could see. "That's my number." Aaron leaned forward. "Seriously?" Rachel nodded. Aaron frowned. "Did you ever talk to the guy?" "No." Aaron checked the call history again. "No outgoing calls to you." Rachel tapped the screen, meaning he saved my number but never used it. Aaron shrugged. Maybe he planned to. Rachel didn't answer. Something about that explanation didn't feel right. Thomas Avery had prepared for his own death with an almost obsessive level of detail. Security cameras, hidden evidence, a recorded message. If he had saved Rachel's number, there was likely a reason. Rachel returned to the evidence board in her office. She placed Avery's photograph at the center. Michael Halpern's picture went to the right. The shadow figure from the backyard camera went to the left. 3 unknowns. 3 possible roles. The victim, the man he feared, and the person waiting outside the house. Rachel picked up a marker and wrote a new question across the board. Why Rachel? Why had Avery expected her to investigate his death? Rachel opened Avery's personal records next. Employment history. Tax filings. Previous addresses. The man had lived quietly for most of his life, an accountant. No criminal history, no prior involvement in violent cases. But then Rachel opened the court records connected to Michael Halpern, and suddenly the connection appeared. 6 years earlier. A homicide case. Victim Daniel Crow. Primary witness. Thomas Avery. Rachel scanned the case file. Halpern had been accused of killing Crow during a late-night altercation outside a bar. The prosecution relied heavily on Avery's testimony. He claimed to have seen Halpern strike Crow during an argument, but the defense had successfully attacked the reliability of the witness. There were inconsistencies in Avery's statements, small details that changed between interviews, enough to introduce reasonable doubt. Halpern was acquitted. Rachel continued reading. The prosecutor who handled the case was someone she recognized, Assistant District Attorney Laura Klein. Rachel leaned back slowly. Klein had worked closely with Rachel on several investigations during that time, which meant Avery had probably seen Rachel inside the courtroom. Maybe during the trial, maybe during witness preparation. Rachel opened the archived video from the trial. The footage was grainy but clear enough to show the courtroom. Thomas Avery sat in the witness box answering questions. Rachel noticed something else. In the background of the courtroom footage, seated behind the prosecution table, was a familiar face. Detective Rachel Monroe. She had attended several days of the trial while assisting the prosecutor's office with evidence coordination. Rachel paused the video. Thomas Avery had seen her there. He had watched her work on the case. watched how she investigated, watched how she built timelines, which meant Avery may have chosen her intentionally. Aaron knocked on the office door. "I pulled something else from the phone," he said. Rachel turned. "What is it?" Aaron entered holding a printed document, text messages. Rachel gestured toward the desk. Aaron placed the pages down. Most of them are normal. Work stuff. Bills. He pointed to a specific thread. But this conversation started about 2 weeks before Avery died. Rachel read the messages. "Unknown number. You should have kept your mouth shut. Avery, I told the truth." "Unknown number. That's not what matters." Rachel looked up. Aaron continued. "Message history shows dozens of texts like this over the past year." Rachel turned the page. "Unknown number. You think hiding changes anything?" "Avery, I'm not hiding." "Unknown number. You will be soon." Rachel checked the timestamp. The messages stopped 3 days before the murder. Rachel asked the obvious question. "Can we trace the number?" Aaron nodded. "We already did." Rachel waited. Aaron looked uncomfortable. "It belongs to Michael Halpern." Rachel expected that answer. What she didn't expect was the next part. Aaron continued. "But that's not the weird thing." Rachel frowned. "What do you mean?" Aaron flipped to another page. "These messages stopped 3 days before the murder." Rachel nodded. "And," Aaron pointed to the next line, "because Halpern reported his phone stolen 3 days before the murder." Rachel looked at him. "Stolen?" Aaron nodded. "There's a police report." Rachel grabbed the report from the system database. Michael Halpern had filed a theft report claiming his phone was taken from his car while parked outside a grocery store. 3 days before Avery died. Rachel felt the timeline shift again, because the threatening messages came from Halpern's number. But if the phone was stolen, then someone else could have sent them. Rachel turned back to the evidence board. Halpern, Avery, the unknown figure outside the fence, and now possibly a fourth person. The one who had stolen Halpern's phone. Aaron crossed his arms. "You think someone's framing him?" Rachel considered the possibility. Halpern clearly had motive. But if someone stole his phone and used it to threaten Avery, then the situation might be more complicated. Rachel looked again at the backyard camera still frame, the shadow figure outside the fence, watching the house, waiting. Rachel suddenly realized something else. If the phone was stolen, she said slowly, then Halpern might not have known Avery was still afraid of him. Aaron nodded. Rachel continued. But someone else clearly did. Aaron thought about that. Which means the person outside the fence might not have been waiting for Avery. Rachel finished the thought. They might have been waiting for Halpern. Aaron raised an eyebrow. You think someone followed him? Rachel nodded slowly. Possibly. Halpern arrives at Avery's house. Someone else is already watching. Halpern enters. Halpern leaves. Then the second person moves. Rachel looked at the timeline again. Halpern exits the house at 11:46. The first emergency call happens 10 minutes later, which meant something happened inside the house during those 10 minutes. Something that caused someone to pick up Avery's phone and call police. Rachel grabbed her jacket again. I want to talk to Halpern. Aaron looked surprised. You think he'll cooperate? Rachel walked toward the door. He already has. Aaron frowned. What do you mean? Rachel looked back. According to the report, Halpern came to the police station last night. Aaron blinked. Why? Rachel picked up the printed interview summary. Because he wanted to tell detectives something. Rachel read the final line of the report out loud. Michael Halpern says he did visit Thomas Avery's house that night. Aaron waited. Rachel continued. He says Avery was still alive when he left. Aaron's eyebrows lifted. That would mean. Rachel finished the sentence. Halpern wasn't the one who killed him. Aaron stared at the evidence board. If that's true, Rachel nodded. Then the killer might be the person who stole Halpern's phone. And the person who had been standing outside Avery's fence watching the entire night unfold. Waiting for the moment when both men inside the house were finished with each other. Waiting for the moment when only one witness remained alive. Detective Rachel Monroe arrived at the county interrogation room shortly after noon. Michael Halpern was already seated at the metal table inside. He looked different from the surveillance photographs Avery had collected. In the courtroom images from years earlier, Halpern had appeared confident, almost arrogant. The man sitting in front of Rachel now looked exhausted. His eyes were bloodshot. His posture slumped forward. Rachel sat down across from him and opened the case file. Halpern watched her carefully. "You're the detective Avery thought would investigate this." Rachel didn't react immediately. "You knew him," she said. Halpern exhaled slowly. "Yeah." "How?" "How?" Halpern leaned back in the chair. "Same way you did." Rachel waited. "The trial." Rachel studied his face. "Daniel Crow's murder." Halpern nodded once. Rachel flipped through the file again. "You were acquitted." Halpern laughed quietly. "Yeah, technically." Rachel looked up. "You didn't sound proud of that." Halpern rubbed his face with both hands. "Because the whole thing ruined my life anyway." Rachel remained silent. Halpern continued. "Doesn't matter if a jury says you're not guilty. People still think you are." Rachel tapped the folder lightly. "Avery testified against you." Halpern nodded again. He thought he saw something. "You didn't kill Crow." Halpern met her eyes. "No?" Rachel studied him for several seconds. "Then why were you at Avery's house the night he died?" Halpern looked down at the table. "Because he called me." Rachel blinked. "He what?" Halpern leaned forward slightly. 2 days ago, Avery called my office." Rachel frowned. "And you agreed to meet him?" Halpern shrugged. "At first I hung up." Rachel waited. "But then he called again." Halpern looked toward the ceiling. "He said he wanted to apologize." Rachel felt a small shift in the case. "Apologize for what?" Halpern gave a humorless smile. "For ruining my life." Rachel flipped to the notes section of the report. "Why would he suddenly do that after 6 years?" Halpern shook his head. "I don't know." But he sounded serious. Rachel considered the possibility. "What did he say exactly?" Halpern thought for a moment. "He said there were things about that night he had never told the police." Rachel leaned forward. "And?" Halpern's voice lowered. "He said the wrong man might have been blamed." Rachel's pen stopped moving. "What does that mean?" Halpern looked uneasy. "That's exactly what I asked him." Rachel waited. "He told me he wanted to explain everything in person." Rachel wrote down the statement. "And you agreed to meet him?" Halpern nodded. "Last night." Rachel checked the timeline. "You arrived at 11 p.m. Halpern seemed surprised. "You already saw the footage." Rachel didn't answer. "What happened inside the house?" Halpern stared at the table for several seconds before speaking. "At first we just talked." "About the trial?" Halpern nodded. "Avery said he'd been thinking about that night for years." Rachel listened carefully. He said he kept replaying what he saw in his head. Halpern paused. "And the more he thought about it, the less sure he became." Rachel felt the case shifting again. What was he unsure about? Halpern looked up. "Whether it was actually me." Rachel wrote the sentence down slowly. "A witness who no longer believed his own testimony." Halpern continued. "Avery told me there was another person in the parking lot that night." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "That wasn't in the trial record." "I know," Halpern said. "Because Avery never told anyone." Rachel leaned back slightly. "Why not?" Halpern gave a small shrug. "He said he wasn't sure at the time if it mattered." Rachel thought about that. A second unknown person present during the original murder. Someone Avery never mentioned to police. Halpern continued. "But last night Avery told me something else." Rachel waited. "He said he finally remembered the man's face." Rachel felt a quiet tension building. "And?" Halpern swallowed. "He said the man had been following him recently." Rachel's eyes narrowed. "Following him?" Halpern nodded. "For weeks." Rachel thought about the backyard camera. The shadow near the fence. Watching? Waiting. Halpern continued. Avery thought the man from the old case had come back. Rachel asked the obvious question. Did Avery know who he was? Halpern shook his head. No name. just the face. Rachel leaned forward. What happened after that? Halpern exhaled slowly. That's when everything got weird. Rachel waited. Avery suddenly stopped talking. Why? Halpern looked uncomfortable. He said someone was outside. Rachel felt the timeline aligning with the camera footage. What did you do? Halpern answered quietly. I checked the window. Rachel leaned forward slightly. Did you see anyone? Halpern nodded. Yeah. Rachel felt a chill move through her chest. A man standing near the backyard fence. The exact location captured on Avery's security camera. Rachel asked the next question carefully. Did Avery recognize him? Halpern hesitated. Yes. Rachel's voice lowered. Who was it? Halpern looked directly at her. You. Rachel blinked. What? Halpern continued. Avery said the man outside looked like someone from the old investigation. Rachel's confusion deepened. Who? Halpern leaned forward. A detective. Rachel felt the pieces sliding towards something she didn't want to consider. Which detective? Halpern swallowed. He said the guy looked like the partner you used to work with. Rachel's heart skipped once. Because she already knew the name that was about to come next. Halpern said it slowly. Detective Mark Ellison. Rachel sat very still. Mark Ellison had been her partner 6 years earlier, back when the Daniel Crowe murder trial happened. Rachel's voice became quiet. Ellison died 4 years ago. Halpern nodded slowly. Yeah. Rachel crossed her arms. Car accident. Halpern looked uncomfortable again. That's what everyone said. Rachel stared at him. What are you implying? Halpern looked toward the interrogation room mirror. Avery didn't think Ellison died in an accident. Rachel felt the room grow slightly colder. What did Avery think? Halpern answered carefully. He thought Ellison killed Daniel Crowe. Rachel said nothing. Because the idea sounded impossible. Ellison had been a respected detective. Her partner. Her friend. Halpern continued. Avery said he remembered something new about the night of the murder. Rachel waited. He remembered seeing Ellison in the parking lot before the fight started. Rachel's hands slowly tightened on the table. Halpern spoke again, and Avery believed Ellison knew he was the only witness who might remember. Rachel's mind raced through the timeline. If Ellison killed Crowe, and Avery eventually realized it, then Avery would have become a dangerous loose end. Rachel forced herself to stay calm. What happened after Avery saw the man outside the fence? Halpern answered quietly. He panicked. Rachel leaned forward. Did the man enter the house? Halpern shook his head. No. Rachel frowned. Then why did you leave? Halpern's voice dropped. Because Avery asked me to. Rachel stared at him. He told you to leave. Halpern nodded. He said the man outside wasn't there for me. Rachel waited. He said the man was there for him. Rachel looked down at the timeline again. Halpern leaving the house at 11:46. Avery still alive. A killer waiting outside. Rachel finally asked the question that mattered most. What did Avery say right before you left? Halpern hesitated, then answered. He said something strange. Rachel waited. Halpern spoke slowly. He said if anything happened, the detective named Rachel Monroe would figure it out. Rachel sat silently for a moment. Because Thomas Avery had predicted this investigation perfectly. Predicted who would handle the case. Predicted how the evidence would be found. And predicted that Rachel Monroe would eventually learn the truth about a murder committed 6 years earlier. The only question remaining now was the most dangerous one. If Mark Ellison had really killed Daniel Crowe, then who was standing outside Avery's fence last night? Because Ellison had been buried 4 years ago. Detective Rachel Monroe remained in the interrogation room long after Michael Halpern finished speaking. The air inside the small space felt heavier now. Halpern sat quietly across from her, watching the detective process what he had just said. Rachel finally spoke. You're telling me Thomas Avery believed my former partner was standing outside his house? Halpern nodded slowly. That's what he said. Rachel leaned back in the chair. Mark Ellison died 4 years ago. Halpern shrugged. I'm just telling you what Avery believed. Rachel studied his expression carefully. Halpern didn't look like a man inventing a story. If anything, he looked confused. Rachel closed the case file in front of her. "You can go for now," she said. Halpern blinked. "That's it?" "For now." Halpern stood slowly. "Detective, I didn't kill Avery." Rachel met his eyes. "I know." Halpern hesitated. Avery thought someone was coming for him. Rachel not him. And he was right. Halpern left the room quietly. Rachel remained seated for several minutes. Her mind replayed every detail of the timeline again. Michael Halpern arriving at 11. The conversation inside the house. Avery seeing someone outside the fence. Halpern leaving at 11:46. Then silence. 10 minutes later, the first emergency call. Nearly an hour later, the second call. Rachel stood and walked toward the homicide board back in her office. She stared at the photograph of Mark Ellison pinned beside the others. Ellison had been her partner for 5 years. A meticulous investigator. Disciplined. Respected. The idea that he might have committed a murder 6 years earlier seemed absurd. But Avery's recorded message had already proven one thing. The victim believed he was about to be killed by someone connected to that old case. Rachel opened the archive system on her computer. She searched for the accident report connected to Ellison's death, 4 years earlier. Single vehicle collision. Late at night. A highway outside the city. The report stated that Ellison's car left the road and struck a concrete barrier. No other vehicles involved. The responding officers concluded the accident was likely caused by driver fatigue. Rachel scanned the file carefully. The report included photographs of the wreck. The vehicle had been heavily damaged. The driver's side crushed. Rachel read the medical examiner's summary. Cause of death, blunt force trauma. Body identified through dental records. Rachel leaned back slowly. Dental records were reliable, but something about the report bothered her. She picked up the phone and called the records division. "I need the autopsy photographs from the Ellison case." The technician hesitated. "That file's archived." "I know." A moment later, the images appeared on her screen. Rachel examined them carefully. The body had suffered extensive injuries, but the face was mostly intact. She zoomed in slightly. Something didn't look right. Rachel checked the dental report again. Identification confirmed using Ellison's dental charts. But Rachel remembered something else about her former partner. Ellison had undergone dental reconstruction surgery 3 years before the accident. Rachel pulled up the medical records connected to that procedure. Several teeth had been replaced with implants. But the dental chart used to identify the body after the crash showed a slightly different pattern. Rachel frowned. The difference was subtle, but it was enough to raise a question. She called Dr. Patel again. "I need you to look at an old autopsy report." "Which one?" "Mark Ellison." There was a pause on the line. "The accident case."
Yes.
Rachel emailed the documents immediately. Dr. Patel studied them for several minutes. Then he spoke slowly. "Where did you get these dental charts?" "Ellison's medical file." Another pause. "These don't match the autopsy record." Rachel closed her eyes briefly. "That's what I thought." Dr. Patel continued. "If the charts are correct, the person identified after the accident may not have been Mark Ellison." Rachel leaned back in her chair. "Meaning the body in the crash might have been someone else?" "Yes." Rachel thanked him and ended the call. The room suddenly felt very quiet, because the implication was enormous. If the body in the accident wasn't Ellison, then Ellison might not be dead at all. Rachel turned toward the investigation board again. She removed the small note reading, DEEASD, for YEERS Ageno, from beneath Ellison's photograph. Then she replaced it with a different word, MySING. Rachel stared at the board. If Ellison had faked his own death, then he had spent the past 4 years living under a new identity. And if Avery had somehow realized the truth, then Avery might have become the only person who could expose him. Rachel grabbed her jacket again and headed back toward the Avery residence. The crime scene team had finished processing most of the house, but the property remained sealed. Rachel stepped under the yellow tape and walked toward the backyard fence. The same fence captured in Avery's camera footage. Rachel stood exactly where the shadow figure had appeared in the video. From this position, the man outside the fence would have had a clear view of the house. Clear view of the windows. Clear view of the front door. Someone standing here would have seen Halpern arrive. Seen him enter the house. And waited. Rachel walked slowly along the fence line. Then she noticed something in the dirt near the corner of the yard. A small indentation. Rachel crouched down. A shoe print. Fresh. The soil was soft enough to preserve the pattern. Rachel photographed it. The tread design looked familiar. Heavy. Angular. The kind of boot pattern used by law enforcement footwear. Rachel stood slowly. Her former partner had worn boots like that every day on the job. Rachel looked back toward the house. If Ellison had been standing here, then he would have waited until Halpern left. Waited until Avery was alone again. Waited until there were no witnesses. Rachel walked toward the basement door again. Inside, the folding chair still sat in the center of the room. The recorder remained sealed inside its evidence bag on the table. Rachel imagined the sequence. Avery recording his message. Halpern arriving. The conversation about the old murder. Avery seeing Ellison outside. Halpern leaving. Then the basement door opening. Rachel spoke quietly to herself. Ellison comes downstairs. She imagined Avery turning to face him. A man he thought had died years earlier. A man who had once been Rachel's partner. Rachel looked at the stain on the basement floor where technicians had removed a small trace of blood earlier. The murder had happened upstairs. But something had clearly happened down here first. Rachel examined the room again. Then she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A small scratch on the recorder. Fresh. Rachel lifted the evidence bag carefully. The recorder had been moved. Someone had handled it recently. Rachel imagined Ellison discovering the device. Listening to Avery's recorded message. Realizing the victim had prepared evidence. Realizing the police would eventually find it. Rachel whispered the conclusion out loud. He took the recorder upstairs. He used Avery's own voice. Played it near the phone. Placed the second emergency call. And then left. Rachel placed the recorder back on the table. The timeline suddenly made perfect sense. But the most disturbing part of the entire case was only not becoming clear. Because if Mark Ellison had faked his death 4 years ago, then the man Rachel believed had been her trusted partner had spent years carefully removing anyone who could expose him. Daniel Crow, Thomas Avery, and possibly others. Rachel walked back upstairs slowly. The sun had almost set outside. Long shadows stretched across the quiet street. Rachel stood in the doorway of the house and looked out toward the sidewalk. Somewhere out there was a man who had once worn the same badge she did. A man who knew exactly how detectives worked. A man who understood how investigations unfolded. Which meant Mark Ellison probably already knew something else. Rachel Monroe was the one trying to find him, and if Ellison truly was alive, then he might already be watching her the same way he once watched Thomas Avery. From a distance, waiting for the right moment to make the next problem disappear. Detective Rachel Monroe returned to the precinct just after sunset. The hallway lights inside the homicide unit glowed dimly as night shift detectives began replacing the day team. Rachel walked directly into the digital forensics lab again. Aaron Delgado looked up from his workstation. "You're back already." Rachel placed the evidence bag containing the recorder onto the desk. "I need to hear the recording again." Aaron frowned slightly. "You already went through it." Rachel nodded. "I want to hear it differently." Aaron connected the recorder to the system. The audio file appeared instantly. Rachel sat down beside him. "Play the entire thing." The speakers filled the room with the faint static of the basement recording. Thomas Avery's voice began again. "If you're hearing this, then it means he finally did it." Rachel closed her eyes. She had listened to the recording several times already, but now she was listening for something else. Not the words, the timing, the spaces between them. Aaron watched her quietly. Avery's voice continued explaining the evidence hidden behind the basement wall. The cameras, the photographs, the name Michael Halpern. Rachel suddenly lifted her hand. Pause. Aaron stopped the playback. "What?" Rachel leaned closer to the waveform displayed on the screen. "Zoom into the audio." Aaron enlarged the section. The visual pattern of the recording expanded across the monitor. Rachel pointed at the silent spaces between Avery's sentences. You see these gaps? Aaron nodded. Normal pauses. Rachel shook her head. Not exactly. She tapped one of the spaces. This gap is longer. Aaron examined the timeline. 3 seconds. Rachel nodded, but listened closely. Aaron replayed the section. At first there was nothing, just faint background noise. But when the audio was amplified slightly, a quiet sound appeared beneath the silence. A faint mechanical hum. Aaron frowned. That's not part of Avery speaking. Rachel nodded slowly. Exactly. Aaron increased the amplification. The hum became clearer. A low electrical vibration. Aaron looked confused. Sounds like an appliance. Rachel leaned back. Or a police radio. Aaron blinked. What? Rachel explained. Older patrol radios make that exact background hum when they're powered on. Aaron replayed the section again. Now the sound was unmistakable. A steady radio frequency buzz. Aaron turned toward Rachel. You think someone else was in the basement when Avery recorded this? Rachel nodded slowly. The microphone on the recorder is sensitive. Aaron stared at the waveform. If another device was operating nearby, it would capture the interference. Rachel pointed at another silent gap. Check this one. Aaron zoomed in again. This time the audio revealed something else entirely. A faint clicking sound. Rhythmic. Aaron replayed it several times. Sounds like metal. Rachel nodded. Badge clip. Aaron turned toward her. You're serious. Rachel nodded. When officers move around, the badge or radio clip sometimes taps against the belt. Aaron leaned closer to the screen again. The clicking repeated twice, then stopped. Rachel spoke quietly. Avery wasn't alone when he recorded that message. Aaron leaned back slowly, which means the killer might have been inside the house already. Rachel shook her head. Not the killer. Aaron frowned. What makes you so sure? Rachel pointed the audio again. Because the noise appears early in the recording. Aaron looked back at the timeline. The interference occurred within the first few minutes of Avery speaking, long before Halpern arrived. Rachel continued. If the killer had already been there, Avery would have reacted. Aaron nodded slowly. So whoever that was, Avery trusted them. Rachel said nothing, because she was already thinking the same thing Aaron was about to say. Aaron looked uneasy. You think Ellison was there? Rachel didn't answer immediately. But the possibility now seemed unavoidable. If Ellison had visited Avery before Halpern arrived, then the entire timeline might be even more complicated than they realized. Aaron spoke again. There's something else. Rachel looked up. Aaron pulled up the audio spectrum view. Look at this section near the end. Rachel leaned closer. The waveform became jagged suddenly. The audio distortion lasted less than a second. Rachel frowned. What caused that? Aaron replayed the moment. A loud thump echoed faintly in the recording. Rachel's eyes narrowed. That's not background noise. Aaron nodded. Something hit the floor. Rachel thought about the basement layout again. The folding chair. The table. The recorder. Aaron replayed the sound again. Rachel suddenly realized what it resembled. A body hitting the ground. Aaron looked at her. You think Avery was attacked in the basement? Rachel shook her head slowly. No. She rewound the recording again. The thump occurred during a pause in Avery's speech. But Avery never reacted to it. He continued talking calmly afterward. Rachel leaned back. That means it happened somewhere else in the house. Aaron frowned. How could the recorder pick it up? Rachel answered quietly. If the basement door was open. Aaron replayed the sound once more. The timing of the thump aligned almost perfectly with a subtle shift in Avery's voice, as if he had briefly listened for something. Rachel whispered the realization. That was the moment Halpern arrived. Aaron blinked. You think the knock at the door caused the noise? Rachel nodded. Someone upstairs opening the door too hard. Aaron looked impressed. You're reconstructing the entire timeline from a sound file. Rachel smiled faintly. That's the job. Aaron leaned back in his chair. So Avery recorded the message while someone else was already inside the house. Rachel nodded. Someone with a police radio. Aaron glanced toward the investigation board through the lab doorway. Ellison. Rachel didn't answer, but the pattern was becoming clearer. If Ellison had visited Avery earlier that night, then he might have been trying to confirm something, confirm whether Avery truly remembered the old murder. Rachel spoke quietly. Ellison probably came to scare him. Aaron frowned. But then Halpern showed up. Rachel nodded, which forced Ellison to leave. Aaron thought about the timeline again. So Ellison waits outside. Rachel continued the reconstruction. He watches Halpern enter. Aaron nodded. Watches him leave. Rachel finished the sequence. And then Ellison comes back inside. Aaron exhaled slowly. That's when Avery dies. Rachel looked at the board again. The evidence was finally beginning to point in one direction. But there was still one question that bothered her. If Ellison had returned to kill Avery, why make the second emergency call afterward? Why draw attention to the crime scene? Aaron asked the same question. Why risk calling the police? Rachel stared at the recorder on the desk. Because Ellison didn't want the case ignored. Aaron looked confused. What do you mean? Rachel answered slowly. He wanted someone specific to investigate it. Aaron waited. Rachel turned toward the contact list still open on Avery's phone. The name saved there. Rachel. Aaron finally understood. You. Rachel nodded. Ellison had made the second call using Avery's recorded voice. He had deliberately ensured the police would return to the house, and he had done it knowing Rachel Monroe would eventually be assigned to the investigation. Aaron spoke carefully. Why would he want you involved? Rachel stared at the evidence board again. The photographs. The timeline. The old murder case. Then she said something that made the room feel suddenly colder. Because Ellison knows I'm the only one who can prove he's still alive. Aaron blinked. Why would he want that? Rachel looked toward the window. The city outside was now dark. Streetlights glowing across the streets. Because somewhere out there was a man who had carefully planned this entire sequence. A man who had waited years for the truth about the Daniel Crowe murder to surface. And the only person who could expose that truth was, as the detective who once trusted him the most, Rachel Monroe. Detective Rachel Monroe left the precinct shortly after midnight. The city had grown quieter as the late hours settled over the streets, but Rachel's mind remained loud with unanswered questions. If Mark Ellison had truly faked his death 4 years earlier, then the accident that supposedly killed him would no longer be the end of the story. It would be the beginning. Rachel drove out toward the rural cemetery where Ellison had been buried. The burial records listed a modest plot in the older section of the grounds. No elaborate headstone. Just a small granite marker with his name, the dates of his birth, and the date the department believed he died. Rachel parked near the entrance and walked the rest of the way. The air felt colder away from the streetlights. Rows of gravestones stretched quietly across the hill. Rachel reached the marker within minutes. Mark Ellison. The letters were clean and sharp in the moonlight. She stood there for a long moment, remembering the years they had worked together. Ellison had trained her when she first transferred into homicide. He had taught her how to read crime scenes, how to spot lies in witness interviews, how to reconstruct timelines from fragments of evidence. He had been one of the best investigators she had ever known. And now she was standing over his grave wondering if the man beneath the stone had ever been there at all. Rachel crouched down and examined the soil around the headstone. The burial had taken place 4 years earlier, but the ground looked different. The grass covering the plot was uneven compared to the surrounding graves. Rachel leaned closer. There were signs the soil had been disturbed more recently, not freshly dug, but not 4 years old either. Rachel stood again and called the night supervisor for cemetery operations. Within 20 minutes, the caretaker arrived carrying a flashlight and a ring of keys. He looked confused. You're saying the police want to open this grave? Rachel nodded. Tonight. The caretaker hesitated. That requires authorization. Rachel held up her badge. You're looking at it. The man sighed and unlocked the small maintenance shed. An hour later, a portable floodlight illuminated the cemetery hillside. Two workers began digging carefully into the soil surrounding the coffin. Rachel stood nearby watching silently. The shovel struck the wooden lid just after 3 in the morning. The workers cleared the remaining dirt away slowly. Rachel stepped forward. Open it. The lid creaked as the nails were removed. The caretaker lifted it carefully. Rachel looked inside. The coffin was empty. The caretaker stepped back in shock. Rachel said nothing, because she had already expected this outcome. If Ellison had faked his death, then there was never a body to bury. Rachel turned away from the grave. The cold night air felt sharper now. She looked back toward the dark hillside of the cemetery. Ellison had gone to extraordinary lengths to disappear. A staged car accident. A body misidentified through altered dental records. A funeral attended by colleagues who believed they were burying a fallen detective. Rachel returned to her car and drove back toward the city. By the time she reached the precinct, the sky was beginning to lighten with early morning gray. Aaron Delgado was still in the digital lab. He looked surprised when Rachel walked in. "You look like you've been up all night." Rachel dropped a file onto his desk. "The grave is empty." Aaron blinked. "Ellison faked it." Rachel nodded. Aaron leaned back in his chair. "That explains why Avery was so terrified." Rachel crossed her arms. "Avery figured it out." Aaron looked confused. "How?" Rachel pulled a document from the folder. "Bank records." Aaron leaned closer. Rachel pointed to a series of withdrawals. "These came from an account belonging to Ellison's brother." Aaron, "Read the dates." "Recent transactions." Rachel nodded. "Someone's been accessing the account every month." Aaron frowned. "But Ellison's brother died 2 years ago." Rachel nodded again. "Exactly." Aaron slowly realized what she was implying. Ellison's been using the account to survive. Rachel placed another photo on the desk. It was the still image from Avery's backyard camera. The shadow near the fence. Aaron studied the outline carefully. Hard to see his face. Rachel pointed to the figure's stance. The posture. The shoulders. Aaron looked up. "You recognize it?" Rachel nodded slowly. "That's how Ellison always stood when he was watching a suspect." Aaron leaned back in his chair. "So Avery figured out Ellison was alive." Rachel continued the reconstruction. "Avery must have recognized him while reviewing the old case details." Aaron nodded. "And Ellison realized Avery knew." Rachel finished the thought. "So he came back to silence him." Aaron thought about the timeline again. "But why involve Halpern?" Rachel shook her head. "I don't think Ellison planned that part." Aaron raised an eyebrow. "You think Halpern showing up was coincidence?" Rachel nodded. "Avery invited him." Aaron leaned forward. "So Ellison arrives first." Rachel continued. "He hears Avery recording the message in the basement." Aaron added the next step. "Then Halpern arrives." Rachel nodded. "Ellison leaves before he's seen." Aaron followed the sequence. "Halpern talks with Avery." Rachel finished. "Halpern leaves." Aaron exhaled slowly. "And then Ellison returns." Rachel walked to the homicide board again. She pinned a new note beneath Ellison's photograph. "Alive." Aaron looked at the board quietly. "So now what?" Rachel answered immediately. "Now we find him." Aaron gestured toward the evidence. 4 years hiding. No address. No job. No identity. Rachel stared at the photo of the shadow near the fence. Ellison didn't disappear randomly. Aaron waited. Rachel tapped the board. "He stayed close enough to monitor Avery." Aaron nodded. "Which means he never left the city." Rachel picked up the recorder again. "If Ellison made that second emergency call." Aaron finished the thought. "Then he was still near the house when police arrived." Rachel nodded. Aaron frowned. "But he vanished before officers searched the property." Rachel looked toward the crime scene photos again. The quiet street, the surrounding houses. Then she noticed something. Across from Avery's house sat a small abandoned property. Boarded windows. A detached garage. Rachel pulled up the map of the neighborhood. The building had been vacant for nearly a year. Rachel pointed to it. "Perfect place to watch the house." Aaron nodded slowly. "And perfect place to disappear from." Rachel grabbed her jacket again. "Let's go see it." Aaron stood. "You think Ellison's still there?" Rachel looked toward the door. No. Aaron frowned. Then why check it? Rachel answered quietly. Because if Ellison was watching Avery from that building, she paused. Then he might have been watching me too. Aaron's expression shifted. You think he expected you to reopen the old case? Rachel nodded. Ellison had spent years avoiding detection. He would know exactly how investigations worked. And he would know Rachel Monroe better than anyone. Which meant there was one terrifying possibility. Mark Ellison didn't just want to avoid being caught. He wanted Rachel Monroe to find him. And if that was true, then the next move in the investigation might already be part of a plan he had been building for years. The abandoned house across from Thomas Avery's property had once been a small rental unit. Now it stood dark and empty. The windows were boarded. The yard was overgrown. From the street, it looked like nothing more than another forgotten building waiting for demolition. But Detective Rachel Monroe knew better. If someone had been watching Avery's house for weeks, this was the perfect vantage point. Rachel stepped through the broken gate while Aaron Delgado followed behind her carrying a flashlight. The front door creaked as Rachel pushed it open. Dust filled the air. The house smelled like stale wood and damp drywall. Aaron swept the flashlight across the living room. Old furniture, broken glass, nothing obviously disturbed. Rachel walked slowly toward the front window. Even through the boarded panels, there were narrow gaps where someone could easily watch the street. From that position, the Avery house was clearly visible. Aaron noticed something near the wall. Rachel, she walked over. On the floor sat an old folding chair, positioned directly beside the window. Rachel crouched down. The floor beneath the chair showed faint impressions where the legs had pressed into the dust repeatedly. Someone had been sitting here often, watching. Aaron turned the flashlight toward the corner of the room. You're going to want to see this. Rachel walked over. A small table stood against the wall. On top of it sat a portable police radio. Rachel stared at it. The model was old, but it was identical to the units used by the department 6 years earlier. Aaron spoke quietly. Ellison's. Rachel nodded. Next to the radio sat something else. A sealed envelope. Rachel picked it up slowly. Her name was written on the front. Rachel Monroe. Rachel opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was unmistakable. Mark Ellison's. Rachel began reading silently. Aaron waited. Rachel finally spoke out loud. He says he knew I'd come here. Aaron crossed his arms. Of course he did. Rachel continued reading. Ellison's letter explained everything. 6 years earlier, Daniel Crow had discovered something he wasn't supposed to see. Crow had been working late one night when he noticed a police detective meeting secretly with a local narcotics trafficker. That detective was Mark Ellison. Crow confronted him days later, threatened to expose the relationship. Ellison killed him during an argument in the parking lot behind the bar. Thomas Avery had been the only witness. Avery testified in court believing he saw Michael Halpern commit the crime. But as years passed, Avery began to question his memory. Eventually, he realized the man he had seen near the scene wasn't Halpern. It was Ellison. Rachel finished reading the letter. Ellison admitted he had staged his own death after realizing Avery was beginning to remember the truth. The car accident had been carefully planned. The body placed inside the vehicle had belonged to a man already dead from an overdose. Ellison altered the dental records himself. Rachel lowered the paper slowly. Aaron spoke quietly. So Avery figured it out. Rachel nodded. And Ellison came back to silence him. Aaron looked toward the Avery house across the street. But why the second call? Rachel read the final paragraph of the letter again. Ellison had written something directly to her. Because you're the only detective I ever trusted to finish what I started. Rachel exhaled slowly. Ellison had deliberately staged the scene. The second emergency call, the hidden evidence, the letter waiting in the abandoned house, all of it designed to guide Rachel back through the old case. Aaron looked uneasy. He wanted you to solve it. Rachel nodded. But he also knew what solving it meant. Aaron frowned. What? Rachel handed him the letter. Aaron read the final line. Then he looked up. He turned himself in. Rachel shook her head slowly. Not exactly. She pointed to the final sentence. By the time you read this, I'll be somewhere you won't find me. Aaron exhaled. So he disappeared again. Rachel nodded, but not before confessing. Aaron placed the letter back on the table. That still leaves one problem. Rachel looked at him. What? Aaron gestured toward the Avery house. Avery's murder. Rachel stared through the broken boards of the window. The quiet street looked the same as it had the night of the crime. Rachel spoke softly. Ellison admitted that too. Aaron frowned. He confessed. Rachel nodded. Ellison wrote that when he returned to the house after Halpern left, Avery confronted him in the basement. Avery had already realized the truth. He told Ellison that Rachel Monroe would eventually uncover everything. Ellison shot him moments later. Aaron shook his head, and then staged the call. Rachel nodded. He wanted the body found quickly. Aaron leaned back against the wall. So the case is solved. Rachel didn't answer, because technically Aaron was right. They knew who killed Daniel Crowe. They knew who killed Thomas Avery. They even had a written confession. But Mark Ellison himself was gone. Rachel folded the letter carefully. Outside, the sky had begun to lighten again. Morning sunlight slowly spread across the quiet street. Aaron looked at her. What happens now? Rachel walked toward the door. Now we close the file. Aaron followed her outside. The Avery house stood silently across the street. 2 murders. 1 witness. 1 detective who spent years hiding from the truth. Rachel looked once more toward the abandoned house behind them. Somewhere out there was a man who had once worn the same badge she did. A man who had spent years running from the consequences of one violent night. Rachel finally turned away. The case file would be marked solved, but the man responsible would remain missing. And in the quiet hours of the night, Rachel Monroe would sometimes wonder if Mark Ellison was still out there, watching from a distance, the same way he once watched Thomas Avery's house, waiting for the moment when someone might come close to finding him again, because some cases end with an arrest. Others end with a confession, and a few end with a ghost that was never truly buried.